Dear students, welcome back. This session, let's discuss colonialism and gender, post-colonial feminist perspectives. Post-colonial feminism emerges as a critical intervention in both mainstream feminist thought and traditional post-colonial theory. It addresses the historical and contemporary ways in which Western imperialism and patriarchal structures have intersected to marginalized women in the global South. While early Western feminism often assumed a universal female experience, post-colonial feminists often argue that gender cannot be analyzed in isolation from the history of colonial rule and the persistent hierarchies of race and class. The critique of Western feminist hegemony. One of the central tenets of post-colonial feminism is the rejection of the universal sisterhood model, which was popularized earlier by many Western scholars. Chandra Talpade Mohanty in 1984 famously critiqued the tendency of Western feminist scholarship, which constructed the third world women as a monolithic homogeneous category. In his framework, women from the global south were often depicted as perpetual victims of their cultures, supposedly lacking agency and waiting for liberation. This Eurocentric perspective fails to account for the diversity of experiences among women in post-colonial nations. By centering the white, middle-class Western women as the normative subject of feminism, mainstream discourse often ignored how colonial history shaped the very nature of gender relations in colonized territories. Post-colonial feminists emphasize that for many women, the struggle against patriarchal domesticity is inseparable from the struggle against global economic exploitation and racialized hierarchies. Let's look into colonialism and the intervention of gender hierarchies. Colonialism was not just a project of territorial and economic expansion, it was also a project of social engineering. Many post-colonial scholars such as Maria Lugones argue that the modern gender system was itself an imposition of the colonial civilizing mission. Before European contact, many indigenous societies across Africa, America, and Asia practiced most fluid or egalitarian gender roles. The colonial administrations introduced Victorian age concepts of gender, which enforced a strict binary and relegated women to the private sphere while granting men authority in the public and political realms. In some cases, colonial laws codified patriarchal customs that were previously more flexible, effectively stripping women of their traditional rights to land ownership or community leadership. Therefore, the tradition often cited as the source of women's oppression in post-colonial states is frequently a hybrid construction of indigenous and colonial patriarchal values. The intersection of imperialism and patriarchy. Post-colonial feminism examines how the double colonization of women occurs, once by the imperial power and once by the patriarchal structures within their own societies. During nationalist movements for independence, women often played crucial roles as activists and combatants. However, as Frantz Fanon and later feminists noted, these movements frequently expected women to return to traditional domestic roles once independence was achieved. The nationalist project often used women as symbols of cultural purity. This placed women in a precarious position where advocating for their rights could be branded as westernized or traitorous to the national identity. Post-colonial feminists navigate this tension by arguing that gender equality is not a Western import but a fundamental requirement for true decolonization. They challenge the idea that anti-colonialism and feminism are mutually exclusive, asserting instead that a nation cannot be free if half its population remains subordinated. Economic exploitation and neo-colonialism. The transition from formal colonial rule to the current era of neoliberal globalization represents a continuation of many colonial power dynamics. Post-colonial feminists highlight how the global division of labor disproportionately exploits women in the global south. International financial institutions often impose structural adjustment programs that lead to the privatization of social services. As Gayatri Chakravarti says in her seminal work regarding the subaltern, the most marginalized individuals are often those who lack the means to speak within the dominant discourse. Today, this subaltern position is occupied by women in garment factories and electronic assembly lines in free trade zones. Their labor is commodified by multinational corporations headquartered in the global north, echoing the extraction of resources that defined the colonial era. The economic class of these women is inseparable from their gender and their geographical location in a post-colonial state. Representation and the politics of the veil. When we look at this, a significant portion of post-colonial feminist scholarships focus on the politics of representation, particularly regarding Muslim women. Leila Ahmad and Leila Abu Lughod have challenged the Western obsession with the veil, which has frequently been used as a justification for imperial intervention. Abu Lughod famously asked if Muslim women really need saving argument that the focus on the veil often masks the more pressing issue of political instability and economic precarity caused by foreign policy decisions. This colonial feminism, the use of feminist rhetoric to justify military or political intervention, is a primary target of post-colonial critique. It demonstrates how gender can be instrumentalized by powerful states to maintain a moral high ground while continuing exploitative practices. Decolonizing feminist knowledge to move forward. Post-colonial feminists call for a decolonization of knowledge production. This involves prioritizing the voices and theories of women from the global south, acknowledging that there are multiple paths to liberation. It requires an understanding that rights may be articulated differently in different cultural contexts, and that secularism is not only the framework for female empowerment. Decolonization also means addressing the internal colonialism within global north nations where immigrant and indigenous women continue to face systemic exclusion. The goal is a transnational feminism that builds alliances based on shared goals of justice rather than an assumed sameness of identity. By acknowledging the specific histories of colonialism, feminists can create a more inclusive and effective movement that addresses the root causes of global inequality. Now coming to this session's case study, the Chipko movement in India. The Chipko movement, which began in the 1970s in the Himalayan region of India, serves as a powerful example of post-colonial feminist activism that bridges the gap between environmentalism, gender, and anti-colonial resistance. Historical and colonial context. Now, coming to the roots of the Chipko movement lies in the forestry policy established during British colonial rule. The colonial administration viewed forests primarily as a source of timber for the expansion of the railways and the military. This commercial forestry model ignored the local community's traditional sustainable relationship with the land. After independence, the Indian government largely continued this extractive colonial era policies, favoring large corporations over the needs of local villagers. The role of women, while the movement is often remembered for its environmental impact, it was fundamentally driven by women. As the primary providers of fuel, fodder, and water, women were the first to experience the devastating effects of deforestation. When commercial loggers arrived to clear trees, the women of the Garhwal Himalayas famously hugged the trees to prevent them from being cut down. Now, looking at the intersection of oppression, colonial continuity, the movement was a direct challenge to the state's continuation of colonial land management practices that prioritize profit over local survival. Secondly, gendered knowledge. The women demonstrated a specific localized ecological knowledge that was dismissed by the male-dominated state bureaucracy. Their resistance was the rejection of the idea that development should be defined solely by male-led industrial projects. Class and caste. The activists were largely from marginalized rural backgrounds, highlighting how those at the bottom of the social hierarchy are often the most effective defenders of the environment. Post-colonial significance. The Chipko movement is a quintessential post-colonial feminist case because it did not rely on Western feminist models. It was an indigenous, grassroots response to the intersection of patriarchal state power and the lingering effects of colonial resource extraction. It redefined the role of women as active agents of political and ecological change, proving that their liberation was tied to the health of their land and the sovereignty of their community. Thank you.